think of Carl Sagan. Think how beautifully he turned the English language, using the full resources of the universe, the cosmos, to inspire his literary flair.
So let me now introduce to you a man who has become a symbol of passionate rationalism and Enlightenment values, a fighter for science and a fierce enemy of pseudoscience. Please welcome Professor Richard Dawkins.
So, your book, which is a collection of essays, it's about more or less everything, which makes it rather easy for me. I can ask you about anything. So, but let us start with, I mean, you have been a professor of the public understanding of science. So let us start there. Is that something which has become better or worse? Or what's happening if you some perspective on what has been happening?
I practice this professorship not doing research on public understanding of science. If I had, I might have been a bit discouraged. Another professor of public understanding of science, John Durant, was appointed about the same time in London. And he did research on it, and he found such things as 19% of the British population think it takes 1 month for the Earth to orbit the Sun. And I think it was 27% of the British population think that humans coexisted with dinosaurs. Well, actually, they did, because birds are dinosaurs, but that wasn't part of the... so you could be a bit discouraged if you actually looked at public understanding of science. But I think the way to look at that is as an indictment of us scientists for not getting out there enough and communicating.
But what's happening over time? Is there a development somehow?
I haven't done the research, and being a good scientist, I don't answer without unless I've done the research.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Oh. And in your book, there's an essay on sense and sensibility.
Science and
sensibility. Yeah. I tried to translate backwards from the Swedish translation. Now, you refer a little bit to C.P. Snow at some point, and you also quote similar statements as what he wrote. Is there a difference between the natural and the social sciences in this respect?
Well, an anecdote. My daughter studied social science at Sussex University for a little while before she got fed up. And she listened to a social anthropologist who said, the beauty of social anthropology is that when two social anthropologists look at the same data, they come to opposite conclusions. And at that moment, she decided that this was not for her, and she left and became a doctor instead. I rather take the same view, but no doubt unfairly. I mean, it clearly is proper that one should do scientific research in the social sciences, but a kind of ideology has grown up, I think, in some branches of social sciences which mistrusts truth, almost says things like there's no such thing as truth, or facts are a social construct, that kind of thing.
But the kind of thing that C.P. Snow was worrying about, that it's sort of more... You really should, I mean, to quote something out of Shakespeare, there's something that you can expect from someone who's educated, but the second law of thermodynamics, that's something that you don't need to worry about. Is that something that you also see as a
Well, C.P. Snow gave a famous lecture, called the Reed Lecture, in which he talked about what he called the two cultures. And he was lamenting the lack of scientific culture in the broad society. And he compared ignorance of the second law of thermodynamics to ignorance of Shakespeare. Maybe that's a little bit unfair, but certainly there is a tendency, I think in Britain, or there was a tendency in Britain around that time, for non-scientists almost to glory in, almost to take a delight in their ignorance of science, whereas nobody would ever take a delight in being ignorant of Shakespeare or Byron or Wordsworth. So there was a kind of double standard.
Yeah. and it hasn't really improved, you think? It's more or less the same now?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure that's true, actually.
No, again, you haven't done research on it, no. One thing that you are saying, and you said it a couple of times, is that you think that the Nobel Prize in Literature should be awarded scientists
yes.
in popular writing, right?
Science is a wonderful vehicle for great literature, for poetic literature, for prose poetry. Think of well, we've heard Carl Sagan mentioned. Think of Carl Sagan. Think how beautifully he turned the English language, using the full resources of the universe, the cosmos, to inspire his literary flair. What could be a better subject? Why should the Nobel Prize for Literature go to novels, things that never happened?
Do you think it will happen one day?
Well, here I am in Stockholm. I'm urging you to...
I see. Okay, right. One thing that we obviously have to talk about, and I think that many in the audience expect that, is about your, can I say, crusade against religion, or battle against religion. Is that a fair statement? Is that what you're doing?
I suppose it is fair. I mean, I get a little bit fed up with being the butt of jokes, like if I sneeze and somebody says, bless you, then, oh, I shouldn't have said that. I mean, anyone would think I was the only atheist around, and I mean, I'm willing to bet 3/4 of this audience are atheists, and yet I'm the one who gets the sort of the jokes about it. And so I wouldn't like to think of it really as a crusade, except insofar as organized religion, well, even disorganized religion, conducts a sort of campaign against what we now know to be scientific truth, especially in America, where 40% of the American population, according to Gallup poll, actually believes that the universe is less than 10,000 years old. And as I've often said before, that's equivalent to believing that the distance from Washington to San Francisco is 8 yards. That's the scale of the error. And that is entirely brought about by religious upbringing. So as a scientist and as an educator, I am passionately against that, because it's teaching children falsehood when the truth is so much more wonderful and so much more fascinating and so much more thrilling than the falsehood. So that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is that the great amount of sheer evil that is done in the name of religion, because people are brought up to have faith, which is belief without evidence. And if you believe that it's right to do something because you believe it without evidence, then it's impossible to persuade you out of it, because you don't listen to evidence. And so you simply hide behind a wall of faith. And the people who do these appalling acts, blowing people up, blowing the 9/11, all the terrible explosions, suicide bombs and things, these people believe they're doing right. They think they're God. They think they're doing the will of God. And it's not that they're evil people. They think they're good. And that's what religion can do if it gets hold of a child's brain and molds the child's brain in the early sensitive period, which is what presumably the only explanation I can think of for why so many people grow up believing these daft things.
What was the reason that you started on this, let's say, crusade or whatever? Was it your background as a biologist and facing creationism?
The branch of biology that I'm in is evolutionary biology, and evolutionary biology is in the frontline trench, in America at least, where the battle for science education is being fought. Yes.
Yeah. You have been, of course, very outspoken, and you have a lot of fights, and you have taken lots of blows, as you say, in this sense. Have you ever felt that you have gone too far?
Ever what? Sorry.
Gone too far, sort of, in the fighting. Do you think that you accomplish what you want to do?
Well, I'm not sure about that. there's a school of thought that says you should use soft soap and be gentle and conciliatory. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. It just isn't my way, at least in writing. I'm actually pretty nice in person. But I think, I mean, I do passionately love truth and passionately hate Kant, and that's not a K-A-N-T, that's C-A-N-T. And so pretension, obscurantism. If somebody stands up and talks what he or she actually knows is nonsense and is putting up a kind of smoke screen of obscurity to try to appear profound, I do get very cross about that, and so maybe I can even be quite rude about that sometimes.
Do you think that you're winning the battle?
Well, in the
long run, I mean,
in the very long run,
what do you think will happen?
But
we in general.
Yeah, we are in the long run. We're bound to. I mean, on a scale of centuries, on the scale of years, well, the upward curve has sawtooth, so it's doing that, and so we're in a bit of a downturn at the moment.
Yes.
But that will just be temporary.
But you're optimistic in the long run. Well, it's good. Now, another thing that I would like to discuss with you is sort of the limits of knowledge, and the fact that sometimes, I mean, as a scientist, you might be blamed that you think that you know everything, which is obviously not true, because in fact what you do as a scientist is studying those things that you don't know anything about. So why would you think that the big questions are? I mean, in your field, let's talk about biology.
I mean, we've got two physicists on the panel tonight, and physics in many ways is the senior science, and some of the really, really deep problems lie in physics, and nobody knows whether the deepest of all problems, like where do the laws of physics come from, will ever be solved, or whether they're just all the physical constants, they're fundamental physical constants. Will we ever know why they have the values that they do, or do we just have to accept that? So those are the deep problems. And then biology has its own deep problems, which are the problems of complexity. The complexity. Physics is not a complex subject. It's a profound subject, but not a complex subject. Biology is the science of complexity. And the complexity of things like the brain, where the brain manifests extraordinary phenomena like human consciousness. That's the profound problem in biology, which may or may not ever be solved. I think it's equally exciting, really, to think of a future where everything will be solved, or of a future where there will be problems that are forever insoluble, where we will always find, every time we climb a mountain, climb a hill, it always turns out there's another higher one to climb. And in a way, both of them are equally exciting. I like the idea of solving everything, where we reach a kind of nirvana of where science comes to a halt.
I think it sounds terrible.
Well,
absolutely terrible.
No, I mean, I can see that in one respect it's terrible, but in another respect, I'm going to sneeze. In another respect, it would be immensely satisfying. I think we actually understand everything. I mean, wouldn't that be wonderful?
I think it would be boring. That's what I think. I don't think it will happen. Actually,
I get that.
Now, when you describe physics, I mean, okay, physics has its problems, but that's sort of the problems for physics. Biology has its problem. But what you're saying is that you don't need any more physics. You have the physics that you need to do biology.
That's probably true, yes.
You know, it was wrong in the 19th century. I mean, as you also describe in the book, if you take Darwin, who really had the trouble with the age of the Earth, and then there was fundamental physics missing.
Darwin had trouble from the senior British physicist of his day, Lord Kelvin, who proved that the universe, that the Earth and the Sun couldn't be older than about 25 million years. It wasn't long enough for evolution to take place. And the reason was he thought that the sun was a fire, but burning like a fire, whereas, of course, it's actually a nuclear furnace. So Darwin was somewhat cowed by this, because physics was the senior science, and Kelvin, with the massive authority of the great physicist, was telling him that evolution is impossible because there's not enough time. What Darwin should have said is, your physics may tell you that, but my biology tells me that evolution has happened, and therefore your physics must be wrong, which it was. And rather gratifyingly, it was Darwin's son, Sir George Darwin. Darwin himself was never knighted, but his son, two of his sons were, who was one of the people who made this point in the early 20th century.
Do you think it could happen again? A biologist tell the physicist that you have got something wrong?
Possibly. I can't, obviously, if I could give you an example, I would...
You will get another Nobel Prize, maybe. Yeah. Well, consciousness, I mean, that could, of course, be one of these things. Maybe. Do you think there is something missing there?
Well, I'm a naturalist. I'm committed to the view that there is nothing that is not physics, that there's nothing in the brain that isn't.
But you don't know what physics is, right?
Well,
all of physics.
There's nothing supernatural, and
that we agree.
And there's no dualism. So it must be explicable what's going on in the brain. On the other hand, it's terribly small, and when you think of the computational power of man-made computers and what they can do, and they can be brilliant at chess and brilliant at calculation and so on, but they're not conscious yet. So it does look as though there's some essential part of the question which we're missing. And something perhaps might be a bit mysterious.
Yeah. Maybe this is a good point for you to read. This passage from...
Right.
If you can get the electronics to work.
We suddenly realized that we don't have an English copy of the book.
No. so let's see if this works.
Find it on the iPad.
Oh, you got it.
Okay. So I will read a little bit of the author's introduction, which is a new thing written. The book, I should say, is mostly an anthology of previously published essays, various times. There's comedy, there's tragedy. But this new introduction is genuinely new. And I'm going to read the first page of it. I'm writing this 2 days after a breathtaking visit to Arizona's Grand Canyon. Breathtaking still hasn't gone the way of awesome, although I fear it may. To many Native American tribes, the Grand Canyon is a sacred place, site of numerous origin myths from the Havasupai to the Zuni, hushed repose of the Hopi dead. If I were forced to choose a religion, that's the kind of religion I could go for. The Grand Canyon confers stature on a religion, outclassing the petty smallness of the Abrahamics, the three squabbling cults which, through historical accident, still afflict the world. In the dark night, I walked out along the south rim of the canyon, lay down on a low wall and gazed up at the Milky Way. I was looking back in time, witnessing a scene from 100,000 years ago, for that is when the light set out on its long quest to dive through my pupils and spark my retinas. At dawn the following morning, I returned to the spot, shuddered with vertigo as I realized where I had been lying in the dark, and looked down toward the canyon's floor. Again, I was gazing into the past, 2 billion years in this case, back to a time when only microbes stirred sightless beneath the Milky Way. If Hopi souls were sleeping in that majestic hush, they were joined by the rock-bound ghosts of trilobites and crinoids, brachiopods and belemnites, ammonites, even dinosaurs. Was there some point in the mile-long evolutionary progression up the canyon strata when something you could call a soul sprang into existence, like a light suddenly switched on? Or did the soul creep stealthily into the world, a dim thousandth of a soul in a pulsating tube worm, a tenth of a soul in a coelacanth, half a soul in a... Sorry, I've got to get on to the next page. Half a soul in a tarsier, then a typical human soul, and eventually a soul on the scale of a Beethoven or a Mandela? Or is it just silly to speak of souls at all? Not silly if you mean something like an overwhelming sense of subjective personal identity. Each one of us knows we possess it, even if, as many modern thinkers aver, it is an illusion constructed, as Darwinians might speculate, because a coherent agency of singular purpose helps us to survive.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Then we look towards the past. So if we look towards the future, I mean, really the distant future. So what will be the fate of man in like 1 million years?
The great majority of species that have ever lived have gone extinct. So that's probably statistically the most probable future. There could be reasons to think that we might be exceptional in that respect. If you think about the various reasons why other species have gone extinct, most famously the dinosaurs, which went extinct because a large bolide hit the Earth 66 million years ago. We possibly could survive that. We might even be able to avert it. I mean, there's a school of thought that thinks that we ought to be putting a considerable amount of effort into the technology of how to detect an incoming is perhaps the wrong word, a meteorite, a large meteorite or comet whose orbital ellipse is likely to intersect with ours at some point in the future, which could be predicted, by the way, decades in advance. And then do something like what the Beagle spacecraft did in landing on a comet, this time to propel it. You wouldn't need actually very much propulsion. You only need to change it by a few miles per hour. Either speed it up to give it a slightly bigger orbit, a slightly larger ellipse, or slow it down a bit to give it a shorter one and so miss the Earth. So that's possible. And
but do you really think that's the problem? I mean,
well, I started off talking about that because
I mean, what about the other things that we're talking about? I mean, all the dangers which are coming from ourselves. You're not worried about that?
Exactly. I mean, I started off by saying extinction, and that led me to dinosaurs. But many people forecast that we'll bring extinction upon ourselves.
Yeah.
And the sort of science fiction speculation that one of the reasons why SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence,
Indeed,
has so far not picked anything up, is that the window between a civilization developing the technology that's capable of broadcasting radio waves and then the technology to destroy themselves is very short. And so
a few years.
Little flashes of civilization going off in the universe and then going extinct almost immediately by geological time standards. So that's another possibility. Yes, global warming, of course, let's not talk about that. Martin Rees, I think, has written a book speculating that we've got about a 50% chance of lasting through this century, the 21st century. And one of his worries is weapons of mass destruction, perhaps biological weapons, getting into the hands of not governments who can be expected normally to be fairly responsible, and I stress the word normally. But weapons of mass destruction getting into the hands of sects or cults who actively want to die so that they can get to paradise, and so that their normal calculus of deterrence doesn't work for them. So there are all sorts of reasons to think that we might destroy ourselves. But we probably wouldn't destroy everybody. I mean, there would be possibilities of survivors going down in bunkers and things like that. And the same might be true of the dinosaur event as well, if that recurred. So setting aside extinction, the distant future, what might we evolve into? Is that what you were asking me?
Yeah, well, maybe. Or rather, whether there is a distant future at all.
Sorry?
Whether there is such a future at all, and maybe it's the next few years that will be decisive.
Well, I've been talking about whether there is such a future at all so far. and sort of assuming that there is, then would we evolve into anything else? And I suppose the problem with that really is that in order to predict what might happen, you've got to reckon on a sustained selection pressure, natural selection pressure, going on for a very long time. Something like the sustained selection pressure which must have been around to cause the swelling of the brain of Australopithecus, which our ancestor of about 3 million years ago, which had a brain the size of a chimpanzee, and us. Would something like that trend continue? Would we go on getting a huge, great brain like the Mekong? In order for that to happen, then there would have to be a tendency for the brainiest individuals to be the ones that have the most children. Which in some sense must have been true over the past 3 million years, because otherwise we wouldn't have so much larger brain than Australopithecus. So it must have been true. And it's fascinating to speculate on what the selection pressures were. They're not obvious by any means. It could have been sexual selection, braininess could have been attractive. That's a possibility. Like a peacock's tail. I mean, the brain, it could be the kind of mental peacock's tail, going both ways, by the way, not just one way, like peacocks. It would have to go both ways.
Finally, then, what kind of advice would you give to the people in the audience? What should they do in order to make this future that we are talking about a merry one?
Well, I think we all need to be rational in our policy decisions. We have to be emotional in our personal life, of course. I mean, we fall in love and we do all the things that anybody else does. But when taking decisions which affect the whole world, we must be rational. We must base our decisions on evidence, properly assessed scientific evidence, not prejudice, not bigotry, not emotion. Banish emotion into personal life, if you like, but on public policy, we must be rational and base our decisions upon facts, upon evidence, true facts, not truthiness or whatever the current word was, something else. What's the Trump word for non-facts? Alternative facts. That's right, alternative facts. Yeah. No, facts are facts, and it's science's business to find them out. There are facts, and it may be difficult to find them, but that's what we should base our policy on.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's been a privilege to talk with you.